you so much for joining us. I'm sorry, I just said, Zoe, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Arlen. I will do a brief intro and then I will pull up my slides. Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's having a good morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. It's 4 o'clock where I am, so we're deep in the afternoon. As Arlen said, I'm Zoë Jenkins. I'm the founder and director of DICE, D-I-C-C-E, and I'll be sharing a little bit more about that later. I am also a first year at the University of Virginia. And yeah, just want to say thank you, huge thank you to Arlen for having me here and to ELN for having me as well. And I'm going to share my slides here and hopefully won't have any tech problems and make sure people can see them all right. All right, actually, that did not share. I can tell that didn't do that. Okay, can people give a shout out in the chat if they can see the slides okay?
Yep, looks good here. I'm seeing your full title slide.
Awesome, perfect. Okay, so we're going to start by, or as Arlen said, talking about empathy, equity, and agency in K-12, how to teach it, and more importantly, why we should be doing that. So before we even get into all of that, I want to give a little bit of a roadmap of what exactly we're going to be covering today. So first, I'll be spending a little bit of time talking about my story, so how I got into kind of education reimagination and how I ended up here today. And from that experience that I had in my K-12 experience, talk a little bit about what's missing from schools. So those 3 big things that were on the title slide: equity, empathy, and agency. And then we'll wrap up with some major takeaways. So if you missed part of it or trying to just get the meat of what this presentation is about, just a slide that kind of summarizes all of that. So as Arlen said, we're going to try and do Q&A throughout. There will be time to do Q&A at the end if you have larger picture questions, but I'll try to be stopping occasionally to get questions from y'all. Please drop those in the chat. Arlen and I will be watching for that. And as he said, if you want to ask your question verbally, which would be great because I hate listening to myself talk for an incredibly long time, feel free to raise your hand and then we can bring you up and hear your voice and have a conversation. Awesome. So first, we'll start by talking a little bit about my story. So this is a little bit of a lot of arrows here, but we'll try to walk through what all these pictures are. So first, on the left is a picture of me in November of 2019. So I was a high school junior, and I was in this math and science program in Lexington, Kentucky, which is where I'm from. And I was one of 2 Black students in my grade. And at the time, I was pretty focused on trying to get good grades, doing activities that I liked, and looking at the looming beast that is college applications that was ahead of me. And I was also at the time pretty involved in an organization called the Kentucky Student Voice Team, which encourages students to be partners in education decision-making, policy-making, and research. And at the time, I was the executive podcast producer, so I was getting pretty involved in amplifying the voices of students around the state. Then, if you follow that arrow, you can see me on March 12th of 2020. So we knew that this COVID thing was a thing, but schools hadn't quite shut down yet. That all happened the day after. And this was just a little less than a month after there was an incident at my school with non-Black students using the N-word. And this has been going on for a couple of years while I've been in high school, and finally got the gall to say something to those students and was pretty surprised by the response. So first from those students saying that it was okay to use the N-word so long as they were joking, but then probably worse from my actual school administration. So I reported these students, got called into my administrator's office, and then she asked me, so what exactly do you want us to do about it? And I was shocked. I had perhaps naively assumed that my school knew what to do in a situation like this, that there was some kind of training, some kind of education, a process for helping students both kind of apologize and rectify for their actions, especially when they constitute as microaggressions or identity-related harassment. And what I quickly learned is that my school just lacked the necessary policies and resources to help students kind of tackle these issues as they come up in the classroom, but also kind of outside of school. in the student community. And so with an unusually a lot of amount of time on my hands as the result of school shutting down, I started doing some research. I was like, surely there's some kind of diversity, inclusion curriculum that's for students and that's free and that's accessible, and couldn't really find something that was going to fit for what my peers needed, to fill in the gaps that we had when it came to history and understanding how oppression works, in real time. And so with this lovely group of people over here on that Zoom screen, we founded DICE, which stands for Diversity, Inclusion, Cultural Competency, and Equity. And we actually created that curriculum that we knew that students needed. And it's designed to be taught by kids to other kids, because we recognize that students are great for peer education and teaching students, how to interact with people from different backgrounds from them, but also re-examining the way that we are taught history. And so fast forward a little bit, that was in May, moving on into kind of August, thinking about going back to school, during the 2020-2021 school year. And I knew that I couldn't continue doing this education reimagination stuff full time. If I was a student, if I was required to take all these AP classes, it just wasn't going to work out. And so I took that opportunity to reimagine what my high school education should actually look like. So you can call it dropping out. That's kind of how I refer to it. I left my prestigious math and science program and all the kind of promises of college application season that it provided, and decided to be homeschooled for a year. And I worked with DICE full time. I helped the Kentucky Student Voice team, and I worked with another organization called Civics Unplugged. And as you can see on the top of that screen, got some pretty cool press as a result of that. And now I'm a first year at the University of Virginia, studying economics and youth and social innovation. And I'm continuing to work with DICE, Kentucky Student Voice team, and Civics Unplugged, and get to do a lot of cool workshops kind of like this one. So I'm just going to quickly open up the chat here and just make sure there are not any questions. If you have questions, keep them coming. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat as much as possible so that I can answer those as they come up. All right. Okay, so moving right along. Oh, nope, I see something. Oh, thank you so much, Cheryl. So talking about what's missing from schools. So for my last year of high school, I designed my own school experience, and now a little bit removed from K-12, now kind of in college, I have a slightly better understanding of what exactly was missing from that K-12 experience. And also, I think if we all just kind of take a minute to observe the world around us, something's not right, especially when we're talking about the state of our democracy and our country individually. And that's not to say that it all necessarily stems from schools, but there's something that schools, especially public schools, there's a role that we can play in making sure that people are ready to take on the challenges that we're seeing that are facing our world, and are able to do so from a lens that is productive and that's helpful and that's collaborative. The nice kind of way I like to think about this too, in terms of the role of schools and how that has shifted, is that schools should be preparing students for a great life and not a mere life. So if there are any philosophy, political theory nerds out there, you might recognize that from Aristotle, of talking about how we need to prepare kids not just to survive in the world and to be agents in an economy, but also to prepare kids to be civic agents, to be challenging the systems that exist and rethinking the structures of the world around them. And if you don't take my word for it, you can take the word of Justice Breyer in the monumental ruling that came out last summer of Mahanoy v. BL, where Breyer says America's public schools are the nurseries of democracy. Schools prepare kids to take on the world around them. And a lot of the ways that schools have been structured, especially recently, are prioritized on training students to be employees, which is important. We need students to be work ready when they leave, when they graduate from high school. But we're not necessarily preparing kids to be involved in a democracy. And we need students to be able to reach that level of self-actualization so that they can innovate on the systems that we know are faulty. But if we're not teaching kids how to do that in school, then it's hard to expect our politicians, hard to expect other leaders, nonprofit leaders, and just future generations of voters to challenge the systems as they exist right now. And so there are probably a lot of ways we can approach this issue, but I try to boil it down into just 3 things. I have a huge asterisk right there on values that are missing in education, because I think fundamentally by the fact that you're here, you're either watching the recording or you're live for this webinar, you care about this stuff. And when I say that these things are missing in education, what I'm saying is that it's a systemic failure that we're not including, not an individual failure. We're not giving educators, we're not giving administrators, we're not giving school districts the resources they need to institute these values in schools so that we can produce kids who are ready to be democratic agents. So that's what the asterisk is for, just emphasizing that these are things that we need to institute in education systemically, and that this is by no means an individual failure of any particular educator. So to talk about those 3 things, first is equity. So treating likes alike, and then on the converse, treating unlikes differently. So recognizing that when students walk through the door on the first day of school, they might be receiving the same instruction by a teacher, but they're not coming in at the same place. So how do we give more resources to students who need those resources, but also train students to be aware of where those differences exist? Secondly, taking a deeper look at empathy. So I saw some people in the chat saying that they are involved in social emotional learning instruction. So this is probably right up your alley, but training students to be able to imagine and understand other people's experiences and to react accordingly. And lastly, talking about agency. So training students to understand their ability to have power over their own situation, which is one of the more direct ties to how you create a better functioning democracy. If we want citizens who take their own situation in their own hands and lead the change, we have to model that in the classroom for the 13 years the kids are in K-12. Trying to get to my next slide here. There we go. So we're going to first talk a little bit about equity. And again, if you have questions as we go through this section, I'll make sure to stop at the end so people can bring them in. So equity. I have this picture on here just to make sure that we're all on the same page of how equity is different from equality. We use this picture in our DICE curriculum, and there are a couple other pictures that show inequality, but also justice, which I'll explain in a little bit. So the important thing with this picture is to recognize that we can't give students equal resources and expect them to have the same opportunity to succeed. The key of equity is recognizing where those areas of inequality exist and targeting resources towards those students to make sure that they have an equal opportunity to succeed, not that they just have equal resources. And as you can see, obviously, the tree itself is what's perpetuating that oppression and that injustice, and that justice would be fixing the tree itself to ensure that both of those kids have access to the same number of apples. We'll kind of get into how we get into justice as we talk more about empathy, talk more about agency, but equity is a crucial first step to remedying some of the symptoms that we're seeing right now. And that's because we have to focus on equity because we know that schools and the world itself is not a meritocracy. So this is a meme that I saw on Twitter that I think captures this pretty well, of asking, what's your excuse? Didn't you have a garage? Why didn't you start the next Disney, the next Google, the next Apple? I had a garage growing up. I did not start a Fortune 500 company. I'm not sure what's wrong with me as a result. But the crux of this is to say that something else has to be at play that causes people who have the same resources to not have the same outcomes. And it's important that we are teaching students that the world itself is not a meritocracy. Because while schools should strive to be meritocracies, we know they aren't. And we know that the world itself is not determined purely off of hard work. And I try to boil down to 3 reasons why it's so dangerous for us to be, perpetuating this myth that if you work hard, you're going to get the same results. And the first is that equal work isn't equally rewarded. Hard work isn't the same for all students. And again, while schools should be seeking to be meritocratic, we have to recognize that there's an opportunity gap, that students spending 3 hours on the same homework assignment is not going to yield the same long-term results. And so recognizing what systems are at play and remedying those in the school system is important. Also, from more of a student mental health perspective, acknowledging that the means don't justify the ends. When we kind of teach students that you have to compete and be better, that leads to students kind of going into the far extremes, believing that if they work harder, spend more hours studying, that they're going to be getting better results in the end. And we know, especially for marginalized students, that that's not necessarily true. The story I like to tell about this is that in high school, before tests, we'd often walk in on the day of the test in the morning, and students would be, my peers and friends would be competing about how little sleep they had gotten. So one kid would say, oh, I only got 6 hours of sleep last night because I stayed up studying. Oh no, I only got 3 hours of sleep because I stayed up studying. And we all end up with the same array of grades, right? So we know that just spending more time and, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing the quality of your mental health, and sacrificing your relationships doesn't put you in a better position to succeed. And explaining to kids that the world's not a meritocracy helps teach kids to give themselves the necessary grace to not put themselves through those means, to not get the same ends at the end of the day. And thirdly, talking about how meritocracy perpetuates oppression. We are recreating the systems that we're taught to accept. So if schools are telling students, if you just work harder, if you just spend more time on this, you will do better inherently, then we're bringing that into the workforce, we're bringing that into the world once we graduate. And we know that, again, that that's not how the world works. The story I have about this is throughout my time in school, and this contributed to me eventually leaving my high school, I had a lot of students and peers who would come up to me and say that the only reason that I could get into a good college is because of affirmative action, that there's just no way that I had the proper qualifications, and that affirmative action just existed to give an easy pass to unqualified marginalized students. We know that's not how it works, but that's the story that those students have been led to believe. That's the story that had been perpetuated throughout their time in K-12. And that's something that we as a group of people who are educating other people can ensure that we are not doing, and that we're teaching students the ways in which the world is not a meritocracy, and to acknowledge the ways that equity is important and how to bring that into their lives as well. And so what exactly does equity look like in the classroom? So first is flexibility. When I was with the Kentucky Student Voice team, we conducted this huge study of about 10,000 kids around the state of Kentucky to see how they were dealing with and reacting to COVID as it related to their education. And the big thing that just kept coming up is flexibility. Students were asking, why is so much of my grade tied to attendance when I don't have a ride to school? Why are my teachers expecting me to do X, Y, and Z when I have to work a second job to support my family? Or why do I not have mental health days? I just can't do the work that I need to do and I'm getting punished for it. Schools, as they're currently set up, are not one size fit all. We're rewarding students for coming to class and being attentive every single day, when we know, especially kind of in this semi-post-pandemic time, that that's just not how human beings operate. And so thinking about ways that we can make sure school works for all students and not just those who have the most advantage. Secondly, re-examining and reimagining assessment, which is something I'm sure we're all thinking about, and as more schools are going test optional and reconsidering the role of standardized testing, thinking about ways that we are having systems and ways of assessment that reward inherited wealth. So whether that's financial resources or just cultural capital, rather than mastery of the material, ability to work with your peers, etc. So I definitely don't have the answers, but thinking about other methods that exist to measure students, especially since we know the way we measure students has such a huge impact on their trajectory in school. It determines what classes you get to take, which can determine what kind of diploma you can get, especially in a state like Virginia. And that determines what kind of colleges you can get into and the career options that you have. So making sure that those assessments are fair from the beginning can make sure that students are getting equal opportunities to succeed. And lastly, just encouraging student awareness of why equity is important. And that goes back to making sure that we're not teaching students that meritocracy is a real thing. Classrooms might be the most diverse space that students ever get to be in. So helping them understand how their privilege operates, and more importantly, how they can use that privilege for good. So I'm going to take a second to see if there are any questions. Yes, I love that definition of equity too. Those are all, accessible on our website if people have questions or want to look at more of the graphics. But yeah, this is kind of what equity can look like in the classroom. And something I'll caveat too is you'll note that I'm not necessarily giving a lot of very specific strategies, and that's because as someone who works a lot in student voice and is big into listening to your stakeholders, you all know your students and your schools best. But there's some guidance and some pillars that we have found that are just tested that we know can improve equity, that can improve empathy, and they can improve agency, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So if there are no other questions, we will move along to talking about empathy. All right, so second value that I noticed was missing in my education, empathy. And the backbone of this is just noting that sensitivity is a superpower and not a weakness. I am sure that we have all seen movies or we've interacted with people who make fun of other people for crying, for caring so much about other people. And I think in this day and age, we can all agree that having people who really care about other people is a really powerful and important thing. And it's something that we can educate and incentivize within our schools, even if it's not an explicit school subject that's easy to teach. So I'm noting that I'm using the word equity or empathy very intentionally. Often when we have these conversations and the way I'll talk about empathy, it might sound a lot like diversity, equity, inclusion, or kind of some of the pillars of anti-racism. And I'm intentionally not using those phrases because of the two reasons that are on the slides. So first is that those terms have been manipulated. DEI, anti-racism have been sort of co-opted and softened to be more palatable for white people. And that's just, I think, the truth of it, that we have turned these terms into something that's a little more comfortable and easy to deal with, have crafted solutions that check the boxes of being diverse, that check the boxes of being anti-racist, that aren't necessarily moving at the pace that we need to engage in more radical acts of reimagining what systems look like, especially when it comes to education. Secondly, they've been oversimplified, which is especially true in the midst of this CRT debate of should schools teach or not teach critical race theory when they don't teach critical race theory to begin with. And the thing that's kind of become clear out of all of this is that people just don't know what they're talking about. Either we feel that teaching about race, and to be more specific, teaching critical race theory is going to indoctrinate students into believing that the country is racist, or that it's the right and the woke way to teach history, and that any other way is the wrong way. It doesn't matter really where on that spectrum you fall, but using the words the way we've been using them has been turning people away from having those conversations to begin with. And the Kentucky Student Voice team, we did a survey of students in the state about what they want to learn about race as it relates to this whole CRT debate. And the overwhelming thing we keep hearing is that students want to have these conversations. They want to learn about diversity and inclusion and anti-racism, but they're scared of saying the wrong thing. And they don't feel like they have the right information, and that they're hearing all these terms, they're getting super political, and they don't want to offend someone. And we don't want people to be scared of acting because they're scared of offending people. And so moving away from these terms and centering on something that's easier to digest, but also perhaps truer to the purpose of what we're trying to do is important. As we all know, language is incredibly important to bringing people into this conversation. Because at the end of the day, it's really just about empathy. We want people to understand the experience of other people. So not just history, but understanding how people move through the world and how oppression is working in real time to affect the way people experience their day-to-day lives. There's also this notion of getting in the whole together. I have a video by Brene Brown that I'll show in a hot second, because it's not enough to just know, what someone feels. You have to be able to feel it too, which I think is a real crux of empathy. And it's central to a lot of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. We need people to understand other people's experiences and be able to get in the whole and experience it with them. So take a break from me talking so you all can hear that video real fast. And then we'll come back in like a hot minute once the video is over.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an
Okay, awesome. Can people see me again? Having a little difficulty there.
Yeah, you're back. We can see you and hear you.
Oh, amazing. Perfect. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Yes, I hope it was kind of clear from that video what both the differences between sympathy and empathy, and perhaps why empathy is really, really important to center when we're trying to rethink, the structure of the world around us and make sure that it is a just and accessible place for everybody. There's just no way that we will all be able to understand totally the experience of other people, but trying to find ways to connect on an emotional level rather than looking down and saying, man, it's dark down there, really stinks, and kind of moving along on your way. So assuming that responsibility with you when you recognize that those challenges exist. And lastly, talking about how important it is to be sensitive over being correct. So a lot of the culture around diversity, equity, and inclusion is focused on correctness. So having the right terminology, being able to pinpoint these different things in history, referencing niche frameworks, citing Ibram X. Kendi, and all of that is super, super important. But it's more important that you're able to make people feel understood and heard. And it's really hard to focus on the terminology because that stuff's constantly changing. And our understanding of history is, again, constantly changing. And so the best way to make sure that you are, up to date on what's right is just being sensitive to what different people want, especially as we know that people of different groups want to be referred to differently. People with different experiences have different preferences. And it's really hard to just memorize what all the right rules are. It's in fact impossible to do so, but you can be sensitive to what individuals need, and we can teach students how to do that, while they're students in K-12. So we will take a quick break and look for questions as soon as I can find where the chat button went. There we go. Okay, any questions, comments, or things for empathy? Yes, and I love the point that Herschel's making about, the way we frame this critical race theory debate, I think sparks a lot of fear on both sides, and that there's a way to kind of bring this back to the human focus of it. That this is just about understanding other people, getting in community with other people, and that doesn't require, having the perfect terminology all the time. And in fact, that's much more accessible to people who may not, have as much experience with that. All right. So what does empathy look like? So when we're talking about empathy in the classroom, it looks like modeling inclusion and vulnerability. Kids learn from models. They learn from watching other people do stuff. And so we have to think beyond just reframing our curriculum to teach history in a more accurate and inclusive way, but also thinking about how we moderate student interactions. So if we flash back about 20 minutes or so when I was talking about my own story and that incident that happened at my school that I reported, you'll notice that there wasn't a time where a teacher, intervened in that situation and said, hey, like this is how we interact with students. I'm going to model that for you. You saw that administrator didn't do that either. And that's a major place where we can create change. It doesn't always start with policy, doesn't always start with school-wide trainings, but just walking the walk, showing what it looks like to be an upstander when microaggressions and identity-related harassment occurs, but also to not be afraid to call other students out, to call other administrators or teachers out when that behavior crosses a line. You're modeling to your students what it looks like to be inclusive, but also it's important to model vulnerability. Like if you get it wrong, which I've gotten it wrong, we will all get it wrong, showing what it looks like to say, sorry, how would you prefer me to refer to you? I'm so sorry that I said that. What can I do to fix that? Models for students what it looks like to be vulnerable in those situations. Also, the importance of creating brave spaces. And I have like not safe in parentheses. So safe spaces, I think as we generally refer to them, are places where people are comfortable to share their experiences and to kind of say whatever they want. But the key here is without any challenging. And it's more important that we're creating brave spaces where people in our school communities feel comfortable taking risks, so being vulnerable with other people, sharing those experiences, but are also feeling safe enough to challenge other people. If someone says something that's offensive or is not right or is not reflective of someone else's experience, they should feel brave enough to challenge that comment. And obviously you can tell how this can get out of hand, which is why setting norms is so important. So setting clear avenues for how we're going to challenge other people in a way that's respectful and brings people in instead of calling them out. But it's also important for making sure that spaces are productive and are emotionally safe, especially for folks who tend to be marginalized in these conversations. Lastly, talking about the difference between intent versus impact. I'm sure a lot of us share this experience. I know I was taught when I said sorry to say, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean it like that. And we've all seen the celebrities who tweet those apologies or write things on their notes app and post it to Instagram where it is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. And I think a lot of us know who've been recipients of those apologies, that someone telling you that they didn't mean it like that is not an apology. They're not taking accountability for the impact of their words. And that's something that I think we can model, especially with younger kids, of how to make sure that people are being held accountable for the effects of their action, not for their intent. And that while it's important to recognize maybe the way that your intent didn't come off the way that you thought another student would or another person would, that you still have to, pay homage and do the right thing given the impact of what your words had. And this, is something that helps improve relationships in school, but also just recognizing accountability down the line as we talk about being vulnerable and being empathetic, that people have different experiences and will interpret things differently than you. Okay, that's a great question of how do we as leaders create, a getting in the whole mentality with staff. I think that a lot of it is just, well, first of all, creating a community where people know that that's the norm, where people care about other people. And I think you just have to dedicate the time and the space to it, which is a really hard thing to do because I know as educators, you all have packed schedules and are super, super busy. And I think the key there is just asking a lot of questions and just making sure you're carving out the time to do it with your staff and with students and other people who may interact with your school community. So carving out that time and asking questions about why people feel the way they feel. Because often what kind of shows up at the surface, which we're going to actually talk about in a little bit, what shows up at the surface and the way people are acting isn't necessarily reflective of what they're actually feeling or what's causing them to feel that way. So when someone comes in having a bad day, asking them, like, what are you feeling? Like, why are you feeling that? And like, what can I do to help with that? I think are really key ways that you can help support people and kind of just get a better understanding of what they're feeling and try to connect. What's a time that you have felt kind of the same thing, and look for those opportunities to find that emotional connection. Sorry, I'm recovering from allergy season here a little bit, but that's a really great question. And I hope I kind of sort of answered it a little bit. I hope that was helpful. And yes, Denise, that's right. Saying I'm sorry is not enough. And we can, really teach students that saying sorry is not enough. I know when I was in elementary school, when kids would by mistake trip other kids or things like that was the thing, is oh, you need to go tell that other kid that you're sorry. And I think we can model better for kids what it looks like to take accountability for the impact that you have on other people, and to help kids kind of get in the hole with other kids as well, of let's try and understand why that other student might be feeling that way, even though you may not actually understand why that is the case. All right, so keep the questions and the comments rolling. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but we're gonna move, or we'll have more time for Q&A in this next session, but also lots of time at the end. But we're gonna move along to the last section, which is talking about agency. And if we were to put empathy, equity, and agency in some kind of triangle that shot a laser beam that went to democracy, agency is probably at the top of that. That when people feel like they can connect with others, when people feel like they're well supported, they then just need that final understanding of their own power to translate that into democratic agency and civic engagement. So there are a lot of ways in which schools specifically stifle agency, and a lot of them are at that systems level. So the first is learned helplessness. Students learn early on in school that the best way to kind of get through the process, to get the grades you want, to get approval from teachers, is to not speak up. And we know from our research of school climate and students that when students don't feel like their voices are being heard and that they don't matter to teachers and administrators, they disengage academically. And this is something that we can easily reverse by listening to students and creating spaces for them to solicit that feedback, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Secondly is the idea that schools reward compliance. This was an idea that I was very hesitant to in my time in school, because I was convinced that my hard work and pure intelligence were fueling me, and that's why I was doing so well in the classroom. And that when students would complain that grades or teachers just want them to be compliant with the rules, my thought was the rules were there for a reason, the rules were good. But I've now kind of come more around to it, realizing that a lot of the ways we structure assignments, grades, and also just school-wide policies reward students for their ability to follow directions. And the kind of asterisks I'll put there too is that we often, enforce compliance more so on students of color and low-income students than we do on students with more privilege. That there's an expectation that those students can break the rules, and that's okay, but we're going to enforce that compliance more strictly on those students. That feeds into a belief and understanding that you don't have control over your situation. And if students don't believe they have any control or agency over their situation while they're in school, then we can't expect them to be active democratic agents, to believe that their vote even counts, and to engage in the democratic process and make their voices heard. And finally, talking about punishing incorrect expression. So my principal, Mr. Cotty, has this story where a teacher called on him and said, hey, there's this kid who won't stay in class. He keeps leaving the classroom and sitting outside the drawing. And I need your help, to get this kid back in the classroom. So Mr. Koenig leaves his office, goes and finds the kid. He's sitting against a bunch of the lockers and starts asking him questions, like why are you sitting out here? And it turns out the kid wants to be a sketch artist for a living. So he's drawing the things that he sees as people are walking through the class, walking through the hallways. The kids who walk through the hallway know who he is because he's always out there drawing. And a lot of us on the face of that would say that's a kid who's being disruptive. They're not sitting in class, they're not following the teacher's directions, and that normally would warrant some kind of school punishment. But in reality, that child is just expressing themselves in a way that we have not, set up in a scaffolded way. And so that's what I mean by punishing incorrect expression, that we expect kids when they have problems to schedule parent-teacher meetings, to go talk to the principal, to attend school board meetings. And those are all processes of engaging with school officials that privilege people with the privilege to know that their voice matters and to feel comfortable questioning and talking to adults. So when we unjustly punish students who express themselves incorrectly, we're perpetuating those systems that teach those students that, that this negative relationship with power, and incentivizing students who have, gained the good experience of learning how to talk to adults, how to question the systems around them, who feel comfortable going and talking to their, principals and teachers, which a lot of more affluent kids tend to get that kind of experience. And so in terms of what does agency look like in the classroom, the first is just listening to students. Like I mentioned earlier, students perform better academically and engage more in their school communities when they feel heard. So for students who tend to check out, a great way to involve them is to actually ask them, why is this education system not working for you? How can we make this class? How can we make this school community work for you? And they often have great ideas. And on that note, talking a little bit about co-designing with students, students don't know what they're capable of until they're given a chance to be heard and the resources to get involved. So a great, I think, case study of this is probably just my own personal experience, that when I was, in 4th and 5th grade, I would help to lead a conference that occurred at my school to talk about teaching of the 7 Habits by Stephen Covey. So I was emceeing events for like 300 plus educators, taking, educators from around the world on tours of our school and explaining how our classroom system worked, all at the age of 9 to 10 years old. And that's not to say that all 9 to 10-year-olds are capable of doing that. I don't, that'd be a far-fetched to say they are. But you don't even know what kids are capable of when it comes to co-designing their education until they're given the chance to do so. And often kids aren't given the chance, and then we make this assumption that kids don't have a voice and don't care about their education, but we're not actually making an attempt to co-design that experience with them. And then finally, talking about focusing on global majority students. So talking about students of color, students who are marginalized, and low-income students. These are students who tend to have a more tenuous relationship with power because they are the victims of oppressive systems. So they are taught from an early age to be deferential to people of authority, to not ask questions, to not make their voices heard. And then we expect them to make their voices heard so that we can make better school decisions. And so part of the responsibility of educators in the system, especially in kind of the time that we're in, is to think about the ways that we have enforced these negative, power relationships and to correct them, to help, global majority students feel more comfortable engaging with people in power, to make sure that their voices are being heard and that we're designing an educational experience that works for their students. So we'll quickly take a peek at the chat and see if we have any questions. Yes, the best apology is change behavior that accompanies the apology. That's a big one. And that's something that I believe educators, regardless of kind of what level you are in working with students, can have a huge impact in modeling that for what students should be looking for. All right. So moving along then to talk about kind of the major takeaways of this. So if there's anything that you take away from this, well, hopefully you take away everything else, but hopefully this is, kind of a good summary, is that one, schools are not the great equalizer, but we can do a lot more to foster equality of opportunity. So going back to that point about meritocracy, that just because you go through school and go through K-12 doesn't mean that you're set up for the rest of your life. but there are ways in which schools can make sure that kids are getting an equal opportunity to succeed and to thrive in whatever kind of life avenue they choose to go down. Also talking about how schools are in the business of educating and not schooling. So the niche difference here is that schooling is often more related with compliance, being able to follow the rules and being deferential to authority figures. And that's not what the purpose of school is. If we wanted to raise generations of rule followers, we wouldn't see systematic change that needed to be seen. Instead, we're supposed to be training kids how to interact with kids from different backgrounds from them, learning the necessary and requisite skills and communication tactics to work with other people and to understand the world around them. So focusing on that educating piece, not on the schooling. Third, that community and empowerment matter. So it's not just about the quality of academic instruction you're getting, it's about the quality of the community that you're in and how empowered you feel as a student. We know from various studies, a lot of it student-led research, that students need to feel like they belong in their school community and need to feel empowered to take ownership of their learning in order to actually get anything from the academic experience. And so it's not just about, do you have the newest textbooks? Is your history curriculum up to date? Are students being involved in the curriculum design process? Are they getting a voice in what the school policies look like? And are they being empowered to create belonging as it works for them in their school community? And lastly, to kind of tie it back to the whole schools or the nurseries of democracy, remembering that schools are creating citizens. We're not just creating future employees, we're creating citizens, which informs the health of our democracy. And so if you are at all dissatisfied with the way the world is right now, with how our leaders are leading this country or are leading the world at large, think about the fact that we are educating the next generation of that. So how do we educate a generation to challenge the systems that exist, to think critically about the way the world is and how they can be more empathetic, how they can promote equity and have more agency in making the world a better place. So that is all I have in terms of prepared slides. If you want to follow me, it's at the Zoë Jenkins on Instagram or Twitter. Not super active on Twitter, but I'm trying to get better. I also have a website, zoe-jenkins.com. And if you want to learn anything more about DICE or access our curriculum or provide that to your students, you can go to dice.org. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing so that if people have questions or want to, raise their hand and speak, you can do that. And it's been so nice. Thank you so much for having me.
Zoe, thank you so much. That was very valuable information. Appreciated the equity, the empathy, and the agency. Terrific. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Please type your questions, your comments for Zoe into the chat. If you'd like to ask something verbally on the mic, just raise your hand and I can enable that for you. But we've got several minutes left here with Zoe. We want to make sure we get all our questions and comments. And looks like you're getting lots of thanks in the chat, Zoe, so that's great. It was a very well done presentation, so you would deserve all the kudos.
Thank you. Thank you. Ooh, okay, I see a question. Any suggestions for students claiming it's just a joke? How I responded to it in the moment is probably not the way I would recommend that the people respond. So I'm going to try and learn a little more from myself in the past there. I think the gist of it is going back to that whole intent versus impact thing. So you might be using certain words or certain language because you think it's funny or that's perhaps what's popular in pop culture, but recognizing how that can create an exclusive space for other students. And then talking to those students kind of a couple months after it happened, kind of taking it from that approach, I think helped them understand, why I interpreted their behavior in that way and why, it felt so exclusive, but perhaps it maybe just felt like a joke to them. And just that, trying to encourage people to come down into the hole with you and understand, why that experience, felt the way it did for you. Oh, I was gonna say, Arlen, I can definitely send slides to you to share out with people.
Yeah, if you want to PDF those slides and send them to me, I will make sure to share the slides, the recording, and then for those who are taking this for one professional development clock hour from Illinois, I can send the evaluation that will generate the ISB evidence of completion form as well. So we'll send, if you can get those slides to me this afternoon or tomorrow morning, Zoe, I will send them out with the recording.
I can definitely do that. I can do that quickly today. I was like, I'm honestly just impressed that I finished under time. I always go over. So I made a special note. I was like, I'm going to try and finish a good 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, that was perfect. Didn't feel rushed or anything. So you were able to get through all your content and plenty of time for thank yous and questions, which is great. Oh, good question from Mrs. Deletsky. Yes, you will receive the evaluation tomorrow morning. And when you complete that, you'll get the ISB evidence of completion form for entering the one professional development clock hour for attending. Oh, and Cindy asked for the little video that you shared from, was it Brene Brown?
Yes, the video is linked in the slides.
Okay, good.
And no, Cheryl, I don't think I'm familiar with Be Braven. I don't know if there's a link or anything you can share, and I will be sure to check it out.
Oh, I see Dorothy Reeves has her hand up. Dorothy, I'm going to click the button to allow you to unmute your microphone. And if you've got a question you'd like to share out or a kudos to Zoe on the mic, you are free to turn that on now. Hopefully Dorothy's still there.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was an accident, but great job, great job.
Oh,
No problem. Thanks, Dorothy. It looks like Cheryl has shared with us a Twitter handle at @BeBraven. We'll check that out.
Awesome. I'll make sure to check that out.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any further questions in chat. The Q&A is clear and no hands in the air, so we can wrap up a little early with Zoe. Really appreciate the presentation so much. Like I said, I'll be sending out the recording tomorrow. Everyone is free to hover down at the bottom right-hand corner of their screen and you will see the leave meeting button. It's a big red button and you are free to leave the meeting. Herschel's got one more comment though, if you want to take a look at that, Zoe.
Yes, I was gonna say this. I'll say it's taken me a long time to like hit on like the 3 things, and that was all out of a lot of reflection and thinking back on what didn't go so well my K-12 experience. So hope that was helpful and hope the anecdotes were helpful as well.
Absolutely, appreciate it. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Oh, you got a comment there about the earrings. Yeah, I asked about those too, Casey.
Yeah, so it's like in case you can't see their Uno reverse cards. Arlen and I were talking about it before the webinar started. Once people find out you like something, they just start sending you more of them. So that's what's happened with the weird earrings for me.
Yeah, they look great.